4:30 a.m. April 12, 1861. A single cannon shot rips through the pre-dawn darkness over Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. It screams across the water and explodes against the brick walls of a federal fort, Fort Sumter. That first shot would trigger a response of 75,000 Union volunteers and, in turn, the secession of 4 more states. It was the beginning of a 4-year inferno that would claim the lives of over 620,000 Americans and tear the nation in two. But that shot wasn't a beginning. It was an end. It was the final, inevitable punctuation on a sentence that had been written over decades of anger, division, and a single, irreconcilable question. To ask how the Civil War started is to ask not who fired the first shot, but why the cannon was loaded in the first place. Chapter 1. The Fire Bell in the Night. The story of the Civil War is the story of a nation built on a paradox. A republic founded on the idea that all men are created equal, yet whose economy was built on the backs of nearly 4 million enslaved human beings. This was the fire bell in the night, as Thomas Jefferson called it. A fundamental contradiction that could not last. In the early 1800s, many thought slavery was a dying institution. But in 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. This simple machine made processing cotton so efficient that it became the world's most valuable commodity. This, white gold, was the oil of its day, and the Southern economy became a global king built entirely on the institution of slavery. This created 2 Americas. In the North, an industrial economy was booming. Factories, railroads, and a society built on free labor were rapidly modernizing. In the South, the economy was agrarian, aristocratic, and entirely dependent on slave labor. This was not a small disagreement. It was a deep, moral, and economic fault line dividing the country. Chapter 2. The Paper-Thin Compromises. This divide led to the second great cause, sectionalism, built on the political argument of states' rights. For decades, the battle in Congress was to maintain a fragile balance. The South feared that if free states ever outnumbered slave states, the federal government would have the votes to abolish slavery everywhere. This fear led to a series of paper-thin compromises. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise drew a literal line across the map, declaring that any new state below the line could have slaves, and any state above it would be free. It was a temporary truce. But in 1850, California's gold rush forced the issue. It applied for statehood as a free state, threatening the balance. The resulting Compromise of 1850 was a desperate bargain. The North got California. The South got a new, far more brutal law, the Fugitive Slave Act. This act forced citizens and law enforcement in the North to actively participate in hunting down and returning escaped slaves. It meant that bounty hunters could snatch black men and women from the streets of Boston or Philadelphia. To the North, this was an outrage. It brought the horror of slavery directly to their doorstep. The truce was beginning to tear apart. Chapter 3. Bleeding Kansas. The truce was finally shattered in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This law, pushed by Senator Stephen Douglas, tore up the old Missouri Compromise. It declared that the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska would decide on slavery not by geography, but by popular sovereignty. The people of those territories would vote on whether to be slave or free. The result was Bleeding Kansas, a miniature civil war. Pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri and anti-slavery Jayhawkers from the North flooded the territory. They burned towns, intimidated voters, and murdered each other in the name of freedom. It was here the world was introduced to a man named John Brown, an abolitionist who believed he was God's instrument to end slavery. Brown and his sons dragged 5 pro-slavery men from their homes at Pottawatomie Creek and hacked them to death with broadswords. Bleeding Kansas proved that the political compromises had failed. The only way to decide the issue now, it seemed, was with violence. Chapter 4: The Legal Bomb. As Kansas bled, the Supreme Court prepared to drop a legal bomb that would destroy any remaining hope for a peaceful solution. His name was Dred Scott. He was an enslaved man who had been taken by his owner to live in free territories for years. Scott sued for his freedom, arguing that living on free soil had made him free. In 1857, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney delivered the infamous Dred Scott Decision. The court ruled on 2 explosive points. First, that Dred Scott was not a citizen and had no right to sue. Taney wrote that black men had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Second, and even more catastrophic, the court ruled that the federal government had no power to ban slavery in any territory. The Missouri Compromise was declared unconstitutional. The decision was a total victory for the South. It essentially made slavery legal everywhere. To the North, this decision was a terrifying sign that a slave power conspiracy had taken over the federal government itself. The fault line was now a chasm. Chapter 5: The Meteor of the War. The man from Bleeding Kansas, John Brown, now believed that only a violent uprising could purge the sin of slavery. On the night of October 16, 1859, Brown and a small band of followers seized the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia. His plan was to arm enslaved men from the surrounding plantations and begin a massive, violent rebellion. The raid was a military failure. Brown was captured by federal troops, tried for treason, and hanged. But his impact was earth-shattering. In the North, he was hailed by many as a martyr, a saint who died for liberty. In the South, he was seen as a terrorist. He was the literal embodiment of their deepest fear, that the North would not rest until it had armed the slaves and destroyed their society in a wave of fire and blood. There was no longer any trust. The two sides were no longer just political opponents. They were mortal enemies. Chapter 6: The Final Spark. The nation was a powder keg, and in 1860, the presidential election lit the fuse. The Democratic Party, consumed by the slavery debate, shattered. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas. Southern Democrats nominated John Breckinridge. This split all but guaranteed victory for the candidate of the new Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln. The Republican platform was not to abolish slavery where it existed, but to ban its expansion into any new territories, forever. When Lincoln won the presidency on November 6, 1860, he did so without winning a single Southern state. To the South, this was the end. Their political power was broken. They saw Lincoln's election as a direct declaration of war on their institutions. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina formally seceded from the Union. In their own secession documents, they were explicit. Their position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas quickly followed. They formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America. And that brings us back to that dark harbor in Charleston. A U.S. fort, Fort Sumter, was now an island of Union territory in a hostile new country. When President Lincoln refused to surrender the fort and sent ships with supplies, the Confederacy faced a choice: allow the symbol of Union power to remain or fire. At 4:30 a.m., they made their choice. The Civil War didn't start with a single shot. It started with a fundamental disagreement that was woven into the fabric of the nation. It was a war caused by an economic engine that dehumanized millions, a political system that broke under the strain of compromise, a legal system that denied justice, and a deep-seated fear that the other side was not just wrong, but mortally dangerous. The men who fired that first shot were simply pulling a trigger on a weapon that had been loaded, aimed, and cocked by decades of division, hatred, and the impossible paradox of a nation that was half slave and half free. What turning point in history should we explore next? Tell us in the comments. Also, please hit like, share, and subscribe.